So you can see as he's standing there talking to Jesus, who admittedly is an enigmatic figure, right? One of the things I like about most of the portrayals of Jesus is he's super weird. I don't know if you've noticed that. You all have probably seen a lot more of these kinds of things in your lifetime than I have, but like Jesus always looks so weird on screen. It's like, that dude's weird. Because like he would be, I think. I don't know, maybe not. But he's like looking off in different directions, and Pilate's like looking to see what he's looking at and stuff. Like Pilate, he's just trying to get his head wrapped around, who is this guy? What is happening here? And one of the reasons I love this video so much is he has this kind of up and down where he sort of forgets who he is, and then like offers Jesus some water. Like he has this weird compassionate moment where he's like, you look like you're in pretty bad shape. And then when Jesus rejects the water, he's like, well, my water's not good enough for you, or, whatever. You just kind of fill in the blank of whatever he might be thinking or feeling. But one of the things that I don't like most of the time about how Pilate is portrayed or thought of is how flat he comes across. And what we're going to read today out of John 18, where you can turn there now, we really get to experience, I think, the full range of Pilate's emotional experience through this process. And when I say flat, I mean, we think of him as the governor, right? He's a guy who wields a lot of governmental authority. So he shows up on the scene and he just like issues a decree, and then he's just kind of like off the scene. And then, we get in some of the Gospels, we get that encounter with his wife, where his wife has this dream about the guy that he's really not supposed to have anything to do with, but he's kind of like, and he's like, my hands are tied, I don't know what I can do. We know from history that Pontius Pilate was on thin ice with the Roman government. He did not do a very good job ruling the area, and so he was always kind of on the brink, or on the verge of getting... Well, you don't really get fired from the Roman government. You sort of get publicly executed and somebody else takes your place. So he was not thrilled about that possibility either. And that's one of the reasons I like this video, to set this up, is you get to see his struggle. He's like trying to figure out, how do I deal with this impossible group of people called the Jews, who have this law, and they're always trying to rebel, and everything is always going terribly in this region. And now they've brought me this figure. And the story begins in John 18, verse 28. Because the religious elite in the city, they have enough political clout that they can get an audience with Pilate. That's not a hard thing for them to do, because Pilate has to deal with them. They're the leaders of the people that Pilate is supposed to be ruling. So we see in John 18, verse 28, picking up where we left off from last week, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. We're going to pause right here for a second, because this is the moment where you could get distracted. And I'm going to tell you, don't get distracted. The religious elite are manipulative scumbags. That is the role they play in the story. They are trying to manipulate Pilate into doing exactly what Pilate wants them to do. So you're going to read things that are going to make your skin crawl, and it's going to turn your stomach, and you're going to think to yourself, how could God's chosen people's leaders say things this despicable and awful and terrible? And you're going to be tempted to be distracted and think about them. Don't do that. We already know that part of the story. We hear about that part of the story every Easter. Don't be distracted by the religious elite. Of course, they're scumbags. Look at Pilate. Pilate is our perspectives character this morning. And so Pilate is the one who is on the receiving end of this terrible manipulation. And he is the one who now has to sort through it and deal with it. And that, I think, this morning is going to be far more interesting. Back up to verse 29. Let's keep reading. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. All right, another quick pause here. Pilate sees the manipulation. His skin would crawl just like our skin would crawl, right? He knows exactly what's going on, and he's a political mover and shaker to the point where he became a governor, even if he was not a particularly good one. So he understands that he's being manipulated, and he tries to fire back. Why are you making this my problem? If you know he's a criminal already, take him through your court system and go deal with it. You're wasting my time, you're wasting everyone's time, what are you doing here? And they're like, but we have no right to execute anyone, which is another manipulation, because we know from the Gospels, we've read plenty of times through the Gospels where they pick up stones to stone people to death. Jesus happens to escape most of the time, right? And then in Acts, Paul actually does get stoned to death and then just sort of like revives and he's okay, right? They're more than happy to execute people. But in this particular instance, they don't want to have to execute Jesus because they know that will be an unpopular move with the masses. Jesus pleased the masses because he was the Messiah who healed and he challenged the religious elite and challenged their authority. So they need the Romans to crucify him so that they can be like, oh yeah, that totally wasn't us. That was all Pilate. Pilate did that. Pilate sees the manipulation. He sees that they're trying to get him to crucify or to, well, ultimately crucify, but to prosecute Jesus. And he's like, take him and prosecute him in your law. And they're like, yeah, but we can't execute people and this guy really deserves to die. Right, so then the scene continues. Pilate then went back inside his palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea," Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back to him, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. That's a story we learn more about from the other Gospels. We're going to pause here again. Pilate at this point is annoyed at the inconvenience. You can sort of see the tone of his questions as he proceeds through this line of questioning with Jesus that just start, well, basically the underlying question, regardless of the words he's actually using, the underlying question is, why are you causing them so many problems? Because you're causing them problems, they're causing me problems. So like you're now the object of my frustration. What is it that you've done? I'm trying to understand why they want you dead so badly. But instead of answering that question, which is the question Pilate actually had, Jesus takes his literal questions and answers his literal questions. Pilate's like, "Are you a king?" And he's like, "Well, yeah." And Pilate's like, "Well, okay, that doesn't seem like enough to want to kill this guy," right? And then Jesus goes on this teachable moment, and he's like, "Everyone on the side of truth listens to what I'm saying," and challenges him somewhat directly. But at this moment, Pilate doesn't have time for this. He's caught up in the middle of political maneuvering. He knows he's being manipulated by the religious elite, so he spits, angrily, "What is truth?" and goes back out and tries once again to re-engage the political maneuvering. Because at this point, in Pilate's mind, Jesus is just a pawn in the game. He's being shuffled around the board, and the religious elite are the ones he's contending with. It's like, I'm not going to contend with this prisoner right now. I just need to know why they want him dead so that I can go back and defend myself in this manipulation game that has ensued. So he gets just enough information. He realizes that Jesus calls himself a king, and he's like, okay, that's enough. So he goes back out, and as a way to kind of like shank the side of the religious elite, he comes out and he's like, "The king of the Jews. You want me to set free the king of the Jews?" Knowing that would bother them. Right? Because they're like, no, that's not how we do things, right? Some guy doesn't get to just say, "I'm your king now," and he's the king, right? So the Jews would be really upset and bothered by that, as you might expect, right? So that's not enough for them. No, give us Barabbas. So he has to free Barabbas because this political move that he made didn't work. He thought that they would take the king of the Jews back, or thought they might. So they take Barabbas, and he's like, well, okay, I guess I have to prosecute this Jesus now. And then we pick up here in chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Of course, we read this slap in the face thing from last week, or was it last week? I think it was last week, might have been 2 weeks ago, when Jesus is in front of the high priest. Like everyone wants to just slap Jesus in the face, which is this sign of disrespect, right? And the disparity that we see between the real Jesus, the king of the universe, the one who involved in creation, who from the beginning was with God, is the Word, right? Like all that, and how people are treating Jesus in this moment, right? That's one of the main central Easter themes that can't be missed. It's not the focal point of our sermon today, but acknowledging the way that he was treated compared to his actual station, standing before Pilate. And later he'll say, spoiler alert, later he'll say, "You have no authority except the authority that's been given to you." Right? The juxtaposition between who Jesus actually was and how he was treated shouldn't be missed. But it's just not what we're focusing on today. Instead, I want to draw your attention to the fact that verses 1 through 3 represent the passage of some time. It takes a few minutes, I would imagine. I mean, I've never done it, but it takes a few minutes to flog someone. You don't just and it's done. So they have to move him, they flog him, and then they come up to him again and again saying, Hail King of the Jews. So some amount of time has gone by. So Pilate has had some amount of time to think. He's had some amount of time to process the experience. Because you remember our setting, they have come to his palace early in the morning, perhaps even gotten him out of bed. I don't know, and I'm a grumpy Gus in the morning, so I just assume everybody is. Maybe he comes out and he's not totally ready for all this political maneuvering yet. But now some amount of time has passed, and you're going to notice a tone shift. As he's asking questions and as he's interacting with the religious elite and with Jesus, something seems just a little bit different now. Pick back up in verse 4. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. So we're going to pause right here for a second. Obviously, it keeps going, and that's the middle of a sentence. But do you see the change in tone? Right? He comes out with this carefully crafted sentence, "I find no basis for a charge against him." That's very different from the reaction. What did he do? And the Jewish leaders are like, "Well, if he wasn't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you." And then the maneuvering starts. But this time he comes out with this carefully crafted phrase, "I find no basis for a charge against him." Right? He's trying now to fight back against what the religious leaders want. And perhaps at this point, the only reason that he doesn't want to crucify Jesus is because the religious leaders want him to. That's possible. I would accept that explanation. In fact, I don't know if that's what's going on or not, but we see that there's this, it's a different attitude. And we get this phrase, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. We're like, whoa, all of a sudden now fear is in the mix. Right? At what point did he become afraid? Like what role is this fear supposed to be playing in his decision making or in our understanding of how he's interacting with the manipulation that's still going on? Right, because the manipulation has not let off. The religious leaders are still pressing for their goal. They came in with a game plan. They're executing on their game plan. So now, when the fear sets in, he has to question Jesus for real. He's not just asking the generic question, "Why do they want you dead so badly?" He's now like, "I need to get a sense for this man." So picking back up in verse 8. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it was not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." All right, we pause for a moment here. Pilate's still trying to win this struggle against the religious leaders. And so he gets enough information to recognize that Jesus does not deserve to die. But because of his political maneuvering earlier, where he called Jesus the King of the Jews, the religious elite snap onto that, and they're like, "Oh yeah, he called himself a king. If he calls himself a king, then he is set up in opposition to, the one true king, the Caesar." And now they've got him cornered. Right? So Pilate has to throw a Hail Mary pass in verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So this, I'm going to submit to you, is the length that Pilate did not expect them to go. You know your history well enough that the phrase, "We have no king but Caesar," should hit you square in the stomach and make you want to throw up. But they said it. And Pilate knows the history of the region. He may not have a perfect working understanding of the Hebrew law or something like that, but he knows the history of the region. He knows that this people are such a proud people that they have fought countless rebellions where more of their people died than Romans died, just in the name of trying to get independence for their law, which he might not know that much about, but he knows they feel very strongly about it. And he has now pressed them all the way to them saying, "We have no king but Caesar," which is the biggest betrayal of their law that they could have possibly uttered, other than something really blasphemous about Yahweh or something like that. Now Pilate has made it to the point where he's like, this is really serious. These guys apparently are way more committed to getting Jesus killed than I thought, and I don't really have a choice. Right, in verse 16, we get this lame little sentence fragment that's just like, "Then Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified." I'm going to blow that sentence fragment up a little bit because we get so much more information in Matthew about what happened, and I want you to know that. If you're quick, you can flip to Matthew 27, but don't worry about it. Matthew 27, verse 24. When Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere, right, he goes through this back at this verbal exchange where he's like, "I'm innocent of this blood." And they say, "Yeah, the blood's on us. That's fine." Right? We get this in verse 24. Oops, read the wrong thing. That's all right. "When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. 'I am innocent of this man's blood,' he said. 'It is your responsibility.'" And if you keep reading, it says, "Yeah, we take it on us and on our children." And they just accept that responsibility. And Pilate's like, "I don't want anything to do with this." Right? Because in John, we have this moment, we get this emotional struggle where he's like, who is this Jesus actually? And what is actually going on? And how am I being manipulated? And what outcome do they want? And what outcome do I want? And he finally just makes it to the point where he's like, they will rebel. They will start an uprising, and I will be held accountable for that. Caiaphas will blame me for it, and in the end, it will be all my fault, and I have to do something, so I'm just going to take the appeasement strategy. Because he was trying to set the innocent man free, but he just, in the end, couldn't, right? Because they backed him into a corner by making the statement that he never thought they'd make. "We have no king but Caesar." They've gone on the public record having said that out loud in the court. Now if there's a riot, it's definitely Pilate's fault. So he hands him over. But in the act of handing him over, he's like, "I am innocent of this man's blood. I wash my hands of what you all are doing." Right, so that's kind of a weird thing to say for the guy who just sent him off to be crucified. "I am innocent. Crucify him. I'm innocent of that's the guy right there. The guy right there, crown of thorns on his head. Go murder him. I'm innocent of it, though." "Nope, him. Yep, go ahead. Yep, catch you guys later. Yeah, we'll catch up at lunch." Right? What does this do? What does this gesture accomplish? My hands are wet. I'm innocent of this man's blood. You know where I'm going, right? Because this is where I go in every sermon. If we're Pilate, is this us sometimes? You ever done that? You ever send Jesus off to be crucified while you're washing your hands in a bowl of water that doesn't even have soap in it, declaring yourself clean? Now, Jesus calls on us for a lot. Rarely directly. It's pretty unusual to receive like some sort of direct, here's what Jesus is asking from you today. We have expectations that I think we know well and that we understand. We know that we're supposed to love our neighbor. God's kingdom comes first. And yet it seems like so often when we're caught up in the political maneuverings of our life, when we're backed into the corner of our life, we have no choice, right? Can I do that in wet air quotes? We have no choice. There's nothing left for us to do. We just have to ignore what Jesus is calling us to and live in the real world. Do the thing that has to be done, even though it's unpleasant or unseemly. Somebody's got to do it. It might as well be me. But, meanwhile, this is my excuse bowl that I'm washing my hands in. My hands are clean of it because there was nothing I could really do. They were going to riot. And I'm not going to fill in the blank for you because I trust the Spirit to do that. When you examine your own life and you think about your own excuse bowl that you wash your hands in, you think about the emotional struggle that we go through every time we're trying to make a decision about, do we live for Christ or do we live for ourselves? And we wash our hands in the excuse bowl as though that accomplishes something. Imagine me wiping my wet hands on my shirt the next time you're doing that struggle, right? This is absurd on purpose. Pilate washing his hands as though that absolves him from responsibility is absurd. He sent Jesus to be crucified. An innocent man, a man he knew was innocent, because he got caught up in the political maneuvering. He could not seem to detach himself from his position of power. And so in his mind, he only had one choice left. I will crucify the innocent man because, at least I can save face a little bit. I have to, though. And we do this to ourselves, too. We lie to ourselves about what we have to do when really we could just forget the bowl, let the innocent man go, and let the world mete out at whatever consequences it wants. Shouldn't be surprised. The world is really broken. So, I am going to lift my excuse-laden, wet hands up in prayer over all of us, as hopefully the Spirit is speaking to you as it spoke to me this week while I was preparing this and thinking through it. And we're going to ask God to dry our hands and help us get back on track. So let's pray. God, forgive us for being silly and thinking that our excuses absolve us from responsibility. Forgive us for thinking that we can weasel out or that we can get out on a technicality. Now give us the strength and the courage to just do what's right. We want to do what's right. We really do. We're just weak. And we struggle with it. But God, with your help, we believe that we can do what's right. We believe that we can overcome whatever pressures we're facing and make the right choice. And we're proud to be your people because you're a God who doesn't just leave us here with wet hands. And make us more like your Son, Jesus. Help us to choose what's right. We love you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.